This month I've had two projects that required creating illustrations. I didn't have to use Figma to create illustrations, but I figured it was a fun way to challenge myself to see what I could come up with in Figma. The first project was illustrating a stationery set with and without some paper in it, and getting the textures and the shadows to render in a somewhat realistic way in vector art only turned out pretty good. I've got some room for improvement here. It's work in progress, but this really is what started me down the path of figuring out how to create textures in Figma. The next thing I worked on was this COVID-19 test kit. And in the test kits, there is a textured area where your results show up and where you put the drops in. And if we zoom in here, you can see there's a nice texture to give it a sort of photorealistic look and feel. And this was created by mistake. It was completely created by accident. So I'm going to show you how to create a texture like this in Figma without using plugins and without using raster art. To get started, we're going to make a rectangle, and I'm going to set this to be 500 pixels by 500 pixels. It can be any size, but we're going to use the width and height of the rectangle for a few of the settings that we need coming up. Okay, I'm going to give this a fill of black 100%. You can use any color, but this will make it easy to demonstrate. The first thing we need to do is switch from a solid fill to a linear fill. And I'm going to give this a linear fill that goes from 100% black to 0% black. And we'll leave it at that for just a moment. The next thing I'm going to do is add an inner shadow effect. And I'm going to set the inner shadow to have everything set to 0. I'm going to give the fill 100%. And I'm going to set the spread to be the same dimensions of the container, which is 500 pixels in this particular case. And as soon as I set the inner shadow to a 500 spread, you'll notice something happening here at the bottom. If we zoom in, we can see there's this texture that's created just at the bottom edge where that 0% linear gradient is filling in. Hadn't noticed this initially, but as I came in and started to adjust some of the color settings in my COVID-19 test kit illustration, I really started to notice these textures come through. So what we need to do is go into our linear fill, and if we set this to something less than 100%, let's say 15%, the texture starts to show up even more. If we set it to 5%, it shows up even more. And if we set it to 1%, we start to see that texture really coming through. So the trick that I found that works best is to set this fill percentage to 0.01%. And now the entire box has the texture filled up. And you can adjust this as much as you want to. It will have a different effect on it. From here, you can experiment with your fill settings and your inner shadow settings. For example, if I come back into the inner shadow and I increase the blur to 500, and I reduce the spread to 0, you begin to see the blur comes through. And if I reduce the X or if I reduce the Y coordinates to say negative 250, you can see that the sheen or a sheen starts to appear to get some more realistic effects. So you could experiment with this a whole lot. You can reduce the fill percentage to increase or decrease the amount of texture that's showing up. You can also go up to your layer settings and change the percentage here, and it has a very similar effect. And changing this to something like multiply or screen or lighten is going to be a good idea as long as you have this texture fill over top of another color. So let's draw another rectangle here, and we'll overlay these two shapes. And let's give this a sort of an earthy beige kind of fill. maybe something like that. And as we layer these two on top of each other and push the color to the back, you can see that now the texture is starting to come through over top of the fill layer. What's interesting about this texture hack is that the texture is not part of the shape. If I move the shape around, you can see the texture is stationary. So it's really some sort of rendering bug in Figma that allows this texture to appear. I don't know if they're going to fix it or if it will go away, but I think that it'll probably remain for a while. So come on in and experiment a bit and see what you can come up with. And if you find something even better than this hack, be sure to share it in the Figma community. Speaking of the Figma community, there's a link to a Figma community file along with a Fig blog that discusses how I ended up coming up with this particular hack in more detail. And it also includes a download, so you can download some of the textures that I've already created.